Let's go ahead and start with a word of prayer. Wes, would you start us with a word of prayer?
Let's pray together. Our God and our Father in heaven, we thank you for a beautiful day. We thank you for the beautiful weather. Father, we thank you for the way you sustain us and the way you keep us. You are great and you are an awesome God. Father, it's a privilege to come before you this evening, to come before your majestic throne as we see so many places throughout Scripture, to acknowledge you as the Ancient of Days, the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, and to praise you and to learn more about you and to call your people and to fulfill the prophecies you had through Daniel and through many of the old prophets. We thank you, Father, for your faithfulness and the promises and the prophecies. Father, help us to understand with more depth and greatly that we may be assured in our faith in you. Father, we thank you most of all for the greatest prophecy for Jesus Christ, that he came, he died, he was risen. Father, that through him we may come back to you. It's in Jesus' name we pray.
All right, thank you. All right, so we're in Daniel chapter 9. If you want to go ahead and turn there. If you're visiting with us, we are working on the book of Revelation, but we are doing some background from the book of Daniel to help set up what we're going to be doing in Revelation. The teacher of Revelation is actually not here, so Byron will be doing that, but I am filling in for him and taking care of that. Last time we discussed primarily chapter 2 and chapter 7, and what was the main takeaway that you got out of that section? What did the image of the beast represent?
A series of coming kingdoms, one of which was going to be eternal and greater than them all.
Right. And we went in parallel. We talked about we had the head of gold, chest and arms of silver, legs and thighs of bronze, the legs of iron, and then the feet of iron and clay. And we talked about the various kingdoms that represented. And then you remember we went to chapter 7, and there's various beasts that come up out of the sea, and those are ones that represent those same 4 different kingdoms. And in both cases, you have a kingdom, the kingdom of God, that is given the victory. You have the Son of Man that ascends to the clouds and receives the kingdom in Daniel chapter 7. In Daniel 2, it's the stone that is cut out without hands that hits the statue and destroys it, and then ultimately fills the earth. Now, one of the things that I wanted to mention that I forgot, and I talked to a couple of y'all after this, is I wanted to talk a little bit about why a beast image. And that's one of the things that throws us off when we come to the book of Daniel and also the book of Revelation, is you hardly ever see this image in other places, but yet the concept of a beast is very prevalent in both of those. And so let me just ask you, why do you think that Revelation and Daniel use the image of a beast to describe kingdoms of the world? Any kind of initial thoughts?
So,
Go ahead, I'll come to you. Go ahead.
I was going to say, like, people would maybe assume beasts were very powerful and strong, but then God is more powerful and can overcome any of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And where they come from is really important, because for a time period, I was talking about this some with Alina, for a time period that didn't have submarines, didn't have scuba suits, didn't have all that kind of stuff, and didn't even have all the modern approach on how ships are made, the sea is unruly. It's a place not made for human habitation. You go out there, and you can just imagine people that knew their loved ones that went out there, and they never came back. They were just gone. And the sea is where you would see enormous beasts out there that, I mean, when we see it from time to time, whenever a giant squid is washed up on the shore, or you have like a blue whale, it hurls up these enormous beasts that are bigger and stronger than what we usually see on a normal daily basis. Go ahead. What were you going to say, Wes?
Melissa said basically all of it. You know, a beast is also a sign for animalistic. It's a sign of decreation. It's like a step before man. Even the way sin was before Abel, or before Cain, it says it's crouching at the door. Paul used the same language of false teachers in the New Testament. They're like beasts. It's the idea of not what God would want us to know. It's a sign of decreation.
Yeah, and And so it's definitely right. It's something that's created devolving itself, or a way that we might think about it. It's actually an inversion of the image of God concept. So remember, when man is made, they are to have dominion or rule. And that rule is for the benefit of the creation, to cultivate it and to work with it. And the idea is when man leaves God, they result to act like beasts. And that's why it's pictured as following passions, anger, malice, sexual drive, all of those kinds of things. And so that's a good image for the nations that has, as where he's describing, as a group of people. It's not just one person, it's an entire society that has given itself over to that. It is forsaking God and is all about pursuing its own desires and destructive habits. And you're right, all the way through, even Old Testament, New Testament as well, it's picturing when men do that, they're behaving like beasts. And so it's got kind of both of these images of what happens out there in the sea, the uncontrollable side of that, as well as the nature of what those animals do in a fallen creation, in an inverted image of God concept. Okay, so that's a little bit of the ideas of why this is actually being used in this way, and that's what the biblical authors are trying to paint a picture of as we read these kind of stories. Okay, questions, comments, any need for clarification on that? Go ahead.
It's borne out in Nebuchadnezzar's story because he's acting like a beast. He's like, just killing people and throwing them into furnaces, and, these different things. And God's like, okay, I'm going to humble you, and I'm going to make you become like you're already acting in this kind of fallen, animalistic way.
Yeah, exactly. You're going to become what you are.
Yeah.
And you're going to lose what it really means to be a human. And that's just a picture all the way through. Other questions, comments, thoughts along that line? Hopefully that's helpful to kind of, with so much of this, what we really need are just handles to where we can just understand what the writer is trying to explain to us. All right, so what I want us to do, if there's any other questions, comments before we get into chapter 9? All right, what I want us to do is briefly look at chapters 9 through 12 is what we're going to do. And we're not going to be able to read all of these, but we're going to get the relevant sections. We just, for the sake of time, we're not going to be able to do that. But I want us to look at some of these relevant sections as they relate to the book of Revelation and to see what are the figures that are going to be picked up by that book. Because a lot of this is historical background that you need. And we'll see, particularly with this section in Daniel chapter 9, why the book of Daniel was so important between the Testaments as well as in the first century, because of what it describes throughout all of that time period and also what it predicts and anticipates in that time of the first century. So in Daniel chapter 9, I want us to look here at the first couple of verses. And you'll notice he says that this is in the first year of Darius. So this is after the Medes and Persians have taken over, and they're over the Chaldeans. And Daniel is perceiving in the book of Numbers that according to the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet, that it must pass before the end of desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. So he's seeing what has happened to Babylon, and we might look at that and think, why is he looking at Jeremiah? But if you remember, in Jeremiah and Isaiah, what did they said about Babylon and what God was going to do with Babylon in regards to Israel? Yeah, but the idea is he gave power to Babylon for the purpose of destroying his own people. And yet in both of those books, he actually predicted the fall of Babylon. He said, you're going to do this, but I'm going to judge you. And so now Daniel is saying, okay, that's happened. And he combs back through the book of Jeremiah, the letter that Jeremiah had sent to the exiles. And what did Jeremiah say about how long they were going to be there? Okay, so 70 years. And so he knows that those times are about to be up. And if you remember, one of the things that they were expected to do through those different exile books is that they were supposed to pray back toward Jerusalem, pray to God. They were going to be forgiven, and then they were going to come back into the land. And so what you have here in Daniel chapter 9 is where he is praying for the entire nation as a means of repentance. And so he's going through all of this, and in verse 20 of this chapter, so he's praying all of this prayer. It's a wonderful prayer. We're just not going to look at it for sake of time. But while he's praying, who interrupts him here in verses 20 down through verse 23? Yeah, Gabriel. Now, Gabriel is, it may not seem very obvious, but this is one of the angels that is actually really important. Where else do we see Gabriel in the Bible? What'd you say?
Announces the birth of Christ.
Yes, that's the one that announces the birth of Christ. And so it's the same angel that's right here in Daniel chapter 9. And Gabriel has a message to Daniel that relates to the prayer, but it also is going to explain all of this time till the Messiah comes. And if you remember, when Daniel is speaking here, it's about 400 years until God actually has new revelation after the book of Malachi. It's almost about 500 years from this point right here. And so Gabriel comes and elaborates to Daniel that he is greatly loved, and he has a vision that he wants him to understand. And so that's what the first section we're going to look at. If somebody will read here Daniel 9 verses 27 or 24 down through verse 27. This is the 70 weeks or the 70 units. There's various kind of descriptions of that. But if somebody will read that for us, 24 down through verse 27.
70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. Then for 62 weeks it shall be built again, with squares and moats. But in a troubled time, and after 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off, and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed, and he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week. And for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And the wing of abomination shall come one, and on the wing of abomination shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator.
Okay, all right, thank you. All right, so what we have here is the 70 weeks or 70 units here. And these are in response to what he had just discussed here. So there was 70 years that they were going to be in captivity, but in a sense, what he turns around and says, well, yeah, there were 70 years for that, but it's going to be a whole lot worse. It's going to go on a lot longer before the Messiah comes. And what he's doing is he's explaining what's going to happen in this interim. Now, God is really, really good about this, and it's not always appreciated. But think about what God did with Abraham back in Genesis chapter 15. He goes through and he tells him, okay, this promise is set. You're going to have a nation. But what does he say is going to happen to those people?
They're going to go into slavery for 400 years.
Yeah, for 400 years. It's going to be a while till all of the things that I am predicting is going to come about. And so what you have is a replay of that to a certain extent, where God lets his people know what's going to happen. But then it's just like in that time between Genesis and Exodus, you have about a 400-year gap where God doesn't really speak. There's not a lot of communication. And the same thing is going to happen here. Now, there are 6 things that he says will happen in this time period. And what we're going to do is we're going to walk through a little bit of these, but without getting into every single thing, what does it sound like to you, just on a simple basis? Like if you're just trying to just throw a dart against the board and you're trying to figure out what is he talking about, what would you associate it with? Good.
You're gonna tell me I'm wrong, so. I think it sounds like exactly what happened after it tells about the rebuilding of the temple. It tells about what it's gonna be like during the time the temple stands. And then it really gets down to when Jesus came and he's gonna be crucified, and then there's gonna be a real end to Jerusalem, and that's gonna be it.
Yeah, and I mean, that's pretty easy to get. You might be wondering about why the 70 units and all of that kind of thing, but that's exactly what he's saying. He's saying you're going to go back to the land, they're going to rebuild the city, which is a big concern to Daniel, because he knows there's other hopes, he's looking for the Messiah, and he's saying there's going to be a large gap in between, and then there's going to be a time where the Messiah will come, okay? Now, what people have done with this in trying to explain this is they've basically gone two different routes. They've either gone through and said, okay, these represent an actual number, and I'll give you the number, I'll give you the best example of how they try to line up the years that I've ever seen, okay? I'll give you that one. But there's other people that just go through and say this is symbolic because of the number, okay? And I'm not wedded to either one of them. All right, and so I'm going to give you one, but don't think it's like it has to be this way. I just want to give you the analysis on both sides of those. But now, before we get into that, though, I got to remind us of a really important point. Remember, these times are especially important in the first century. Do you remember when you come into Luke chapter 1 and Luke chapter 2, what are they looking for? Remember, Luke's really intentional to mention this, but what are they looking for?
Messiah.
Yeah, they're looking for the Messiah. And why do you think they're looking at it at that specific time?
Time is up.
Time's up, right? They know generally, based off what Daniel said, hey, it's getting close. And now things have started to act a little bit differently. The Spirit is being poured out on people like Simon. He's had a vision. He's going to be able to see the Messiah in his lifetime. And now you've got these situations like John, you've got Mary, you've got Mary and Elizabeth. Now things are starting to turn again, and they're starting to see, hey, what Daniel had predicted is now coming about. And they had stirred over books like this because of anticipation on that. And so the reason that is important is because of the major themes that Daniel is going to talk about have to be resolved. They're anticipatory to the first century, and they've got to come to completion. All right, so let's talk just a little bit about how these times work out. So if you want to make it simply symbolic, that's basically just a short period of time to restore Jerusalem. You have this longer period of the 62 weeks, 62 weeks, that is this longer section in between that actually the book of Daniel explains more about. And then you have this last week, and in the middle of the week, there's an end of sacrifice. There is a decree about the judgment on the abomination. There's a destruction of the city. There's a lot of these various points here. All right, so let's talk about how these work out and what he's describing. Now, this is not my original chart. I've got the people up here, probably people smarter than me that have put some of this together, but this made the most sense to me on what he was describing here. So in essence, these are the dates. And a lot of people come to this and ask, what date is he talking about? Because if you go back and you think about the times that the people were sent back, how many waves went back to restore Jerusalem? Y'all remember?
3.
See, y'all thought y'all were doing Revelation. I got y'all off in between the Testaments. Yeah, 3. There were 3. And do you remember what the last one was? What book is about the last one of those?
Nehemiah.
Nehemiah, okay? And what was Nehemiah's job? Build the wall. And if you remember, he said that the city is basically it's not in good shape. The walls have been burned with fire. And he talks more about the city, where Ezra and all of them are talking about the temple. And so what is pictured here is the first here is in Xerxes Decree. And the way that they take these to be the 490 years is you just take these as 70 weeks. What's 70 times 7? 490, okay? So that's how they get the years. It's pretty simple. And so if you go through and you take these dates, that's Artaxerxes' decree. That's whenever he sent Nehemiah to go and actually rebuild the city. And you'll notice the city is the primary action right here. It's about the moats. It's about the streets that are being done. And so here's this 7 heptads or units or weeks, and that's the 49 years. And so we have the city that's completed. What you have in this other time right here is actually described in quite amazing detail in the book of Daniel. It's basically where Alexander the Great takes over the Medes, and then his kingdom is broken into 4 different parts, and the main kingdoms that interact with Jerusalem are described. But what you have eventually is Rome comes in. Then you have here the 26th, the anointing here is when Jesus was baptized. Okay, so that's pretty close, right? Then in the middle of the week, as is described there, you have him dying. And then this last part, that's not really specified. And it's just saying that these were completed within this time frame. And if you look at what he's describing, there is a discussion of the destruction of the city. You see that there in the middle of verse 26, and also a judgment on the one of the desolator there in verse 27. But those seem to be parenthetical statements of just saying, here's what's going to happen, and then here a decree is made against the desolators. So you don't have to necessarily put those time frames into the 70 weeks that are pictured here. Now again, you may look at that and say, Shane, you're completely wrong. Here's the reasons. There's 12 reasons why it should be a totally different date. I think this is the best explanation I've seen of an actual critical date, but regardless, it's still symbolic, okay? Now the reason that all of this is so important is because all of this is leading us up to the time of the Roman Empire, the time that all of these things are expected to be completed. And they go through and explain the 3.5 years and the sacrifice and the covenant that is made and the atonement. And what I want you to see, though, more than getting into all the weeds on it, is just to realize Daniel predicted this. He laid out all of this, and he knew it. And the primary point that with all of these dates is to understand that God is in control of human history. He is the one that orders. He's the one that structures. It's not working on man's timetable. It is working on God's timetable all the way through this. And that's the powerful message that's given, but also it's a faith-building message in the sense of knowing that God is there in control of this. Okay, that's my little spill on Daniel chapter 9. Questions, comments, thoughts on that? Everybody with me so far? Anything that needs to be clarified? You can disagree with me if you, if you want to. All right, well, if not, let's move on to chapter 10 now. In chapter 10, and I'll keep that up there, and you can kind of keep that kind of running in your mind. There's a couple of other slides I have in mind. But in Daniel chapter 10, what you have, and this happens in a lot of different places, Lord willing, and if my wife is willing, we'll talk about Ezekiel. But what I want us to see in chapter 10, somebody read here verse 5 down through verse 9 and see if this sounds like anything we've read recently in the book of Revelation.
I lifted up my eyes and looked, and behold, a man clothed in linen with a belt of fine gold from Uphaz around his waist. His body was like beryl, his face like the appearance of lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze, and the sound of his words like the sound of a multitude. And I, Daniel, alone saw the vision, for the men who were with me did not see the vision, but a great trembling fell upon them, and they fled to hide themselves. So I was left alone and saw this great vision, and no strength was left in me. Right, my radiant appearance was fearfully changed, and I retained no strength. Then I heard the sound of his words, and as I heard the sound of his words, I fell on my face in deep sleep with my face to the ground.
All right, what does that sound like?
Jesus appearing to John.
Yeah, it sounds like Jesus' appearance to John. And you have a handful of different cases that are like this. Same kind of imagery, same kind of picture of this same kind of idea. And the reason that I wanted to refer to this is not necessarily to get into all the nuts and bolts of this, but to give you a picture of how the Old Testament prepares us for categories like the book of Revelation. It's to say whenever you have a person come in contact with, I'll just give you personal preference, I think this is the pre-incarnate Jesus. We can go through and talk about that another time. But the categories here is he's coming in contact with deity and he is on his face. And he is really in shock at who he is interacting with. And then this being here has the ability to reveal the visions. Okay, so that's going to give us the same categories for what we're talking about there in the book of Daniel. But what's interesting is what this man talks about. Look at verse 14 here. In verse 14, he's coming actually to tell him he's greatly loved and that he doesn't need to fear because he's set his heart to understand and he's humbled himself before God. And he gives him some information about what is to come. And so 10, 11, and 12 are all basically one vision together. But somebody read for us here verse 14.
Okay, to make you understand what has happened to your people in the latter days, for the vision is for the days yet to come.
Okay, so what's he coming to do?
Understand?
Okay, to understand. To make them understand. Again, we talk about apocalyptic literature. Is it to hide or to make known?
Make known.
Make known, okay? Same thing here. He's trying to make it known to Daniel, but it's something he has to have divine assistance in. Okay, so it's to understand. What else do you see that he's talking about? Who is it about? Who's the primary discussion?
It's about what's going to happen to the people in a later time.
Yeah. So we've got our timetable, the latter days, or last days, and all of this is talking about the time of the end. And remember, it's the end in a certain category, in a certain context. It's easy to read this and think he's talking about the end of time. That's just not what he's talking about, because of who he's talking to. Who is he talking about? What does he say there in verse 14? Your people. Remember, ultimately, this is about Jews. This is Jewish literature. And Daniel is a Jew, and he is concerned about the promises that are set up as a result of that. So this is all about what's going to happen in the future, and particularly chapters 11 and 12 are not about everything that's happening in the world. It's about the things that are happening in the world as they relate to the Jews. Does that make sense? Is that clear? Okay, so that gives us, again, some more categories, some more explanation of the kinds of things that are going to be discussed in the book of Revelation, but also in Daniel. All right, now let's look at chapter 11, because what he does, and there's so many different things we could talk about, but he specifies he's going to talk about the time of Greece. Because right now, this being in Daniel 10 has been fighting against the prince of Persia. He's now going to, and Michael's been helping him. And then eventually Greece is going to come and he's going to fight against him. And so what he does in chapter 11 is basically gives this really long, detailed time frame of all of this area. This nearly 400 years of what we call the 400 years of silence. Except God wasn't really silent. He called the events really before they even happened. He said exactly what was going to happen in that time period. Now, if you remember the Greek Empire, you have, let's pick up here at verse 2. He says, "And I will show you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia,
and of force shall be richer than all of them. And when he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty king shall arise," that's Alexander the Great, "who shall rule with great dominion and do as he wills. And as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the four winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor according to the authority with which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others beside these." Now this is historical fact, and Daniel's actually talked about this already. So Alexander the Great came through and basically took over the known world. I mean, he just flew through it. But what happened to him? Did he pass it on to his son and they ruled 100 years?
He died of I think from bad seafood or something like that.
Yeah, something like that. Or I'd heard that he might have even been alcohol. Yeah. So anyway, something along that line. So he didn't have any children, and it went to his 4 generals. And so what happens here is he talks a little bit about that, but he talks about the king of the north and the king of the south. And that is the ones that had the most interaction with that land. He doesn't get into everything else because, again, it's not about everything in the world. It's about what it means for his people, okay? What it means for the Jews. Okay, so there's a lot of things that go on during this, but there's a few things that are particularly relevant. So let's look here at verse... oh man, there's so much to talk about. We're just not going to have time to talk about everything. But let's pick up here at verse 29 and read down through verse 35. If someone will read that for us that would like to.
11:29-35.
Yes.
"At the appointed time he will return and come into the south, but this last time it will not turn out the way it did before. For ships of Kittim will come against him. Therefore he will be disheartened and will return and become enraged at the holy covenant and take action. So he will come back and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. Forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice. And they will set up the abomination of desolation. By smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant, but the people who know their God will display strength and take action. Those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many. Yet they will fall by sword, and by flame, by captivity, and by plunder for many days. Now, when they fall, they will be granted a little help, and many will join with them in hypocrisy. Some of those who have insight will fall, in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time."
Okay, now, first off, does this sound like anything we've read in Revelation? Yeah, be faithful during the trial that you're going to have. There's going to be a lot of desolation, and the holy people are going to be victorious. Except, obviously, he's like, okay, that's not the end. It's the same kind of thing, but it's not the end. You can tell by the last phrase, until the time of the end, for it still waits the appointed time. Now, what is he talking about? What he's talking about is, in verse 30, the ships of Kittim. We look at that and we're like, again, what is Kittim? That's actually Rome. And so by this point, Rome is starting to grow. Remember when we talked about that last week, Rome was just really small and insignificant? It wasn't that way. And so the king that he is actually talking about here is Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus was awful. And one of the things that he did is exactly what he described here. So Antiochus went down to Egypt, and some ships came from Kittim. Rome came there, and they drew a circle around him and said, okay, are you going to go into Egypt? Because they didn't want him in Egypt. Are you going to go into Egypt, or are you going to turn around? And he was basically didn't want to get into all of the problems with Rome. He turns around, really in shame, and goes back, and he just basically took out all of his anger on the Jewish people. And if you know anything about what Antiochus did, he killed Jews, he killed a lot of Jews. One of the things he did is he desecrated the temple. He removed a lot of the gold. He sacrificed a pig on the altar. He sprinkled the broth from that in the temple itself, which is totally desecrating the entire thing. He forbade circumcision. He burned all the copies of the law of Moses that he could find, and he banned sacrifices to Jehovah. Now, that sounds like it was going to be an awful, awful time. And so he's giving some hope to people in that time. You know what also happened during this? It was the Maccabean revolt. And guess what book they looked to give them a lot of insight to what they were going through? He looked at the book of Daniel for good reason. They were able to know and to have revelation to help them be able to endure. Okay, now what you have here in 36, though, is here's a different kind of king. And this is where Rome really, in my view, of course, there's all kind of different thoughts regarding this. This is where Rome really takes the stage then. And eventually he comes through, starts taking over these areas. And you have a little parenthetical statement here at verse 45. Despite him taking over the king of the south and the king of the north that have been the main ones here, taking over Edom and Moab and Egypt and the Libyans and the Cushites and all of them, he says just this little line, it's the very last phrase of the chapter. Yet he shall come to his end with none to help him. It's easy to read this section and just think Rome is just going to be this amazing power that nobody can stop. And yet even right here, God predicts that they're going to be there for a while, but I'm going to bring them down. Just like I did Babylon, just like I did the Medes and Persians and Greece and so on. Now, again, what is all this about? The primary point goes back to chapter 10 and verse 14. This is about Daniel's people in their time period, in the end of days, which the end of days is this. That's what he's talking about. He's giving more information about that. So what I want us to do is now look at Daniel chapter 12 here. If somebody would, let's go ahead and read Daniel chapter 12. Let's see what time we've got. Let's read Daniel 12 here. Let's just go through the end of the chapter. It's only 12 verses. Somebody want to read that for us?
At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince, who has charge of the people. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never has been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, and some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, shut up the word and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, two others stood, one on this bank of the stream, and the other on that bank of the stream. And someone said to the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the stream, how long shall it be to the end of these wonders? And I heard the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the stream. He raised his right hand and his left hand toward heaven, and swore by him who lives forever, that it would be for a time, times, and half a time. And that when the shattering of the power of the holy people comes to an end, all these things will be finished. I heard, but I did not understand. Then I said, O my Lord, what shall be the outcome of these things? And he said, Go your way, Daniel, for the words are shut up and sealed until the end of time. Many shall purify themselves and make themselves white and be refined, but the wicked shall act wicked, and none of the wicked shall understand, but those who are wise shall understand. For the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate is set up, there shall be 1,209 days. Blessed is the one who waits and arrives at the 1,335 days. But go your way until the end, and you shall rest and shall stand in your allotted place at the end of it.
All right, thank you. All right, so lots of things that we could talk about, and I've only got like 10 minutes to try to walk through this. But there's a lot of relevant sections here that I want us to see that are important. But the main thing I want you to see again is God is in control of human history. And the way that the saints overcome is by being faithful to him. That's a theme picked up with Daniel. It's going to be continued with the book of Revelation. All right, now notice he is writing these things in a book, and he does the exact opposite of what John does. What is he told to do with his prophecy regarding his people?
Shut it up.
Yeah, shut it up, seal it, okay? And I'll give you my own personal viewpoint. I believe that's the document that has the 7 seals on it in Revelation 4 and 5, that the Lamb is now able to unseal, okay? Now, Byron's got to teach the class, so he's going to teach something totally different, but that's my own viewpoint on it. All right, so he goes through and he lays these things out, and he mentions, when is this going to happen? When's the end of this going to come about? But when you look at what he describes here, I want you to put a lot of things in your mind as you look at this. He mentions the time period. He says that it'll be a time of trouble such as never has been since there was a nation till that time. Now, does that sound familiar? It should if you read Matthew 24 or Luke chapter 21. Jesus grabs almost the exact same wording. And he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Remember, this is all talking about the people. And so again, what he talks about is about this king that's coming through to destroy Jerusalem. And this whole section is particularly about that time period. Now, what you'll also see when you come to the studies of Daniel is a phrase, some similar phrases that are important. You'll have last days, latter days, time of the end of the age, and all of those kinds of things. Now, when we read those, what do we think of? Yeah, the end, like the end of the world, right? But remember, this is Jewish literature. It meant something to the people that it was being written to. And he's not talking about the end of the world. He's talking about the end of the Jewish nation as the covenant that God had set up with them. And so remember, the destruction of Jerusalem and the nation were the completion of this. That's what this is. This is the time of the end. It's the same concepts there. Now, we might ask the question then, why is the destruction of Jerusalem so important? Why is it so relevant? And again, there's still more about Rome here. But if you remember in Matthew chapter 23, what Jesus said as he came into the city of Jerusalem, he said that all of the blood of the prophets, and including the ones that he was going to send, his apostles and his prophets as well, was going to come on that present generation. The destruction of Jerusalem was a big deal because it was about what God was doing here. And there's no future, hey, Jerusalem's going to be rebuilt, there's going to be another king, like all of that is completed. And so what you see, though, in the book of Matthew, particularly in 24, are some of these interesting concepts. It's the same idea. There's salvation for those who are faithful, if they will go through it. And there's particularly one way that it's described here. Did you notice what he said here in verse 3? That there are some that are sleeping in the dust of the earth, they shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Now we look at that and we're like, what is he talking about? But what does that sound like?
John 5.
Yeah, John 5. It sounds like resurrection, okay? So let's talk about that one. We may not get to the other. I had another little thing, but I don't think we're going to have time to talk about that one. But, all right, so notice it's not all that erased. He said many. Okay? Now, I think because of the use of the word, he's not talking about the end. He's talking about something that was going to happen at that time period. So what is he describing? Here's a possibility of it. So it's related to these prophecies. Isaiah 26 is a picture about resurrection as well. Another one of them is Ezekiel 37. If you remember, that's the valley of dry bones, where he goes through and says, hey, son of man, will these bones live? And he says that that's a picture of the nation of Israel. The nation of Israel is going to die and, in a sense, be reborn. Okay? Now, let me tell you how I believe that comes about. First off, it comes about through Jesus himself and what his message was. If you remember in John 5, we talked about this. There were 2 resurrections in that text. He has one that is an hour is coming and now is. And that one is a resurrection that begins right now. And what that resurrection is you start listening to Jesus. You listen to him, you have new life right now. And it started. It's like you've been taken from the dead and you've been brought into life. He also uses this one to talk about the final resurrection, or an hour is coming. Okay? Now, let me show you that this is the same way the New Testament writers describe this. Now, when Jesus comes on the scene, there are many bodily resurrections, okay, that are part of the signs of the covenant. They're showing that, just like he's describing here. And in fact, have you ever read this, Matthew 27, verses 50 through 53, where he says that many are raised when Jesus died and been like, what? Why did he actually do this? I mean, when Jesus died, the veil of the temple was rent and many are raised. Well, if you remember, he had said in chapter 24 and verse 15, you should have read Daniel. If you had read Daniel, you would understand what was going on in the destruction of Jerusalem. And I'll tell you, I think he's talking about this as well. More symbols of what Daniel has been talking about. Now, how does this work out for you and me? Well, Jesus is the first fruits. He's the only one that was raised to never die again. Paul says he's the first fruits there in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 of the ultimate resurrection. But that's not the only way the writers describe it. Look at the way Paul describes it in Romans 6. He says you're buried and raised in baptism. And because you've been buried and raised, and you're in the new life now, you will be buried and raised in the future. You see that concept of resurrection there? And then let me show you. Later, he talks about it the same way in Romans 8. He says, if you walk in the flesh, you're dead. But if you are listening to the Spirit, you're alive right now. And you are waiting for the redemption of your body. Okay? So when you think about what Daniel is describing, what's going to happen when the Messiah comes, is there is a resurrection that starts whenever he comes. And he dies and he's buried, and then there is a new Israel that comes out of that. And everybody that hears him and is with him experiences that new resurrection and is part of him. And then they have the hope of that ultimate resurrection. Okay, now I'm sure I blew the lid off of some of y'all's minds on that maybe. But it's pretty logical to understand the way they're describing this. Now, any questions, comments, thoughts on that? Anything I can make more clear? Okay, now the last thing I want to bring up is these critical elements as it relates to what's happening in the book of Revelation. And we're not going to be able to talk a whole lot about the times, but you have a description at the end of this. Times, and half a times. You have various dates. Those they're going to be connected to the dates that you're going to see in Revelation. And I'll let you can look at my material. You can try to explain some of that when you get there. But the critical point about this is there's a scroll that's sealed up about what the future was going to be like. Now that the Lamb has died and been buried and been resurrected, now the story is being unfolded. And now the rest of the story is going forward. Jesus is completing everything he said about the Jewish nation. But remember, Daniel didn't just talk about the Jewish nation. He talked about Rome. And he predicted it, and multiple times he said there's going to be a destruction of the Roman Empire and that power. And so when you come to the book of Daniel, it is basically three things, the book of Revelation is you've got the completion of everything he said about the Jewish nation, completion of everything about Rome, and then the completion of what he promised about the serpent, all the way back in Genesis chapter 3. Okay, I'm done. And I appreciate your attention, and we'll stop right there. If I don't have a baby, and Sunday Safe is going to be here, next Wednesday we're going to do a brief survey of the 4 visions in Ezekiel that are there, and we'll be able to talk more about that, the Valley of Dry Bones at that